baptized a bitter heart, and you're suffering.
Welcome to this week's sermon follow-up video. We hope you guys have had a great week. We are now on week 3 of our summer series, Blessed Summer, and we've been off to a great start. Things have been good. We hope you guys would agree. So this week, our verse is verse 4 in chapter 5. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And we're going to spend the week looking at that, and there's some pretty cool elements that we're going to unpack. So give us a kind of an overview of that, and in that, kind of define mourning, what you mean by mourning.
Yeah. So as Kyle and I were talking about it, the idea of mourning really, for this week's message, is going to be based on really 2 kind of pillars. One is the idea that is mourning something that we have as humanity, kind of in our existence, at least in our society, what we experience on a daily basis. Have we shunned the value of mourning? And the second pillar is going to be, what is the significance of having pushed aside the idea of mourning our sin, which is what the heart of Matthew 5:4 is really saying. Blessed are those who mourn. It's not talking about just general mourning in this case. It's really talking about that idea. Remember, righteousness is our target for Matthew 5 and 6 and 7, but in our case in Matthew 5, righteousness is the target. So the lack of righteousness, our sin, is what we are mourning. To answer kind of Kyle's question of, how would we define mourning? Very simply, it's the idea of the act of being sad, of being grieved, of lamenting. These are all words that you could put in its place. And just even the simplest of that being sadness or brokenness, or some of the sort of synonyms that we would go with mourning. The picture is, and particularly in ancient cultures, is the putting on of black a lot of times, or truly in ancient culture. That's even today we do that, but in truly in ancient cultures it might have been, sacks, throwing on sacks and covering yourself in ashes. If we know the story of Job really well, we know that there was a great deal of mourning that Job went through. And so that's really what we're trying to understand is how does Jesus take such liberty to say, blessed are those who mourn, and then add to it the reward of that mourning, and it is that you will be comforted. That's been the heart. That will be the heart of what we talk about this week.
Yeah, it's good, and we'll find kind of as we go that we try to reject that idea and distance ourselves from it. So the first question falls right into that. Should sadness and mourning be part of our human experience? Why or why not? And that's a place where we could get hung up on that question for a while, so we want to kind of be clear on that.
Yeah. So the opposite of this is this movement within our culture towards happiness. I just, having come off of the funeral for my stepfather-in-law, Sam, who was just a delightful, God-fearing man. He will be greatly, greatly missed on this earth. But outside of maybe even those we're getting less and less comfortable with, the idea of death. Mourning is a place where you'll see those things happen. Again, drawing back to sort of ancient experiences, mourning would be days and weeks long. They would not rush through it. And so the human experience, or our current day, our modern day human experience, is to continually minimize more and more to the point where we almost never experience sadness anymore. Hopefully I don't step on too many toes with this. It's not really something that I'm trying to do. But I think even in the area of medications, right? Medications are even one of those very controversial things within the family of God. To say, are there times for it? Are there places for it? I think there's good conversation that can happen around it. But sadly, I think that's an example of where, in some cases, we are trying to medicate away the emotion of grief, the emotion of sadness, the emotion of mourning in general. Right now, we're not really even talking about sin specifically, but just the general disposition of mourning. And so I think it's important for us. The answer for me is that yes, should sadness and mourning be part? They are a part of the human experience. We are falsely masking it, and I think it's to our detriment that we are doing so.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
So.
So the second question comes right out of that. If we get the first one wrong, we say no, it's not part of our experience, then the second question won't make any sense. And it is that Solomon in Ecclesiastes 3 gives no indication on how long certain seasons should last. It goes, there's a season for this, a time for this, right?
Right.
And there's no indication that as to a time frame of that. What might determine the length of time that we mourn that season? What determines that season and what affects that duration?
Yeah. In verse 4, he says there's a time to weep and there's a time to laugh. There's a time to mourn and there's a time to dance. And like with so much of the wisdom literature, you find this parallelism, you find this contrast or comparisons within poetry. And so you have these two very distinct contrasting dispositions, one of weeping and one of laughing, or much like that, a parallel of one of mourning or one of dancing. And so, the length of that, Solomon gives no indication on how long any one particular season will last. And it really does have to do, Kyle even alluded to this a few minutes ago in the pre-video conversation of that God is, whatever it is that God is doing, is just sort of, that's what's dictating it, is following it all the way through, following all the way through what he is trying to accomplish. And again, our way of handling it is to cut it short. We want to get through it as quickly as we can and move on to the more joyful aspects of life. And so really what I think Solomon is teaching is not so much how long, but that there is a season for it. That's somewhat of the learning, is just to acknowledge it. And like in question 1, the answer is yes, it should be part of our human experience. The length of time Solomon doesn't necessarily address, but I think rightly said, what is God doing to it? What is he accomplishing? For Job, it was, they sat on the heap for, I think, 7 days before anyone said a word. When Job had lost all that he had lost, and his friends come and to sit with him, they sit for 7 days before they say a word. Now, that's not a formula. That's just a reality to go, mourning is a part of our human experience, and whatever God is doing should dictate how long we kind of wrestle in that.
Yeah, and I think to some extent we can, I don't want to say determine the length of it, but we can affect the length of it mainly if we are disobedient, if we say, I'm going to buck against this, whatever God is doing in me in that mourning. If I'm going to rush through it and try to justify things or try to move towards things, which we'll get to in the next couple of questions, then I can prolong that period,
Right.
Which would actually be better than skipping it altogether and not getting the benefit of what is needed for that sanctification process.
That's right.
Going through it. So
it's kind of like pay me now or pay me later. I mean, God's intent for mourning it's purposeful. We think that mourning is the bad side of happy, which that's not at all. That does not seem to be biblical whatsoever. Yes, we want to run very quickly to the idea that in our eternal state, in heaven, that there will be no more tears. These are the things that we hear described in Scripture, fairly enough, that there will be no more tears. So that just automatically makes us think that mourning is just a bad to the good of happiness and joy. When in our human experience, that's not what God is suggesting. Because of our human experiences, there will be mourning. And we need to sort of begin to embrace, not to reject.
Yeah, absolutely. So third question there is, what is the difference between dwelling in our sin and mourning our sin? Mourning our sin is really kind of that's the point. I mean,
Right.
Mourning in general, for sure, but sin is kind of where it zoom into, and that's kind of the main point of this Sunday. So what's the difference between dwelling in our sin and mourning our sin? And that is a very important distinction to make.
Right.
As our application comes out of that in so many different ways.
I think we talked, again, as we prep for these videos, as Kyle and I were talking, it's really usually great banter. And so...
all the best stuff is before the video.
It is. You guys get such scraps. But if we could find a way to do that, right?
Yeah.
Let's video... Yeah, anyway. Okay, that seems strange. But what we really felt like as we were talking together about it is that you will be able to see and observe whether you are dwelling in sin or whether you are mourning sin based upon the outcome. It's almost looking at it in reverse, or looking at it from the end and then going backwards. Because what Jesus makes very clear is that blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But going from the end backwards, if there is comfort, then at least helps you to understand maybe what I'm experiencing, or as I start to experience that comfort, that maybe I was truly mourning. There's a sense of that it is accomplishing its work. If there is no sense of comfort, if guilt is where we find sort of the end game, then we realize that probably what we have been doing is dwelling wrongly in sin, or dwelling in it and living in it and not experiencing a freedom from it. So it's an important distinction to make, the difference between dwelling and mourning.
Yeah, and when we don't, I mean, that's it right there. When we don't make that distinction, kind of our default is, well, you would say, well, we shouldn't dwell in our sin. Of course that's true. Of course that's true. We're forgiven of it, and the price has been paid, and to sit there in chains and in bondage when we've been freed is absolutely counterproductive. When we don't see the difference, that's where we go to. That's what we think of in this dwelling of it. And dwelling in our sin is a crippling. It has a crippling effect, and it has a bondage effect. And we were kind of talking about this before. Also, it has this. When I think of dwelling in something, it's an unproductive stewing in, and guilt and in fear, and that's when we start to feel like, I'm not good enough, I'm not usable, God doesn't love me, He's going to put me on the shelf, all these different things that I've certainly dealt with before in my own heart.
Absolutely.
And so when we just dwell in our sin and we sit there and think, well, I'm so bad I can't be forgiven, that's not what we're talking about. Mourning is more of I recognize, I'm agreeing with God that this was wrong.
Yeah.
And I'm mourning the fact that it has happened, that I have done this, and in comes grace. That's why like you said, the result is comfort. The result of dwelling is guilt. The result of mourning is comfort.
Yeah.
And that's the huge distinction to make, and it's super important. And it goes right into the fourth question there. How does our view of mourning sin impact our personal sanctification? And it's always good to draw that distinction. Like, how does this, what I'm going through, the pain or whatever it is, the mourning, how does this benefit? What's God's plan in this? Why is this part of the human experience still?
Yeah.
And it's going to have to do with sanctification.
And I really think that we talk about what is the question before we go into these. What is the question that we really kind of want the climax question to be? And while all of them I think are valuable and they kind of create hopefully a singular picture of mourning, I think question number 4 is really where I would, if in your groups or as you prepare for it, really spend time, because we want to look more like Jesus. And Jesus was literally described as the man of sorrows. And while not his own sin, like we were saying, not his sin, but rather sin in general, brought a sorrowfulness to Jesus. And so even in our sanctification, the more that we recognize sin, really the better off it is, right? Once the problem becomes pronounced, then we attack it with all that is there. Once you know the disease, you know the medicine that is meant to resolve that disease. Once you know the ailment, once you know the problem, once the mechanic has determined the problem in the engine, then solutions are just awaiting that, right? There's always a solution to this, but when the problem is not fully understood, then the good that awaits it cannot be properly applied, or it isn't even applicable at all. The idea that Jesus didn't die for comfort, Jesus did not die for inconveniences, Jesus did not die for anxiety, Jesus died for sin. And until we call things sin and mourn those things, then the weight of heaven cannot come and answer those questions. And so if we want to look more like Jesus, then we are going to mourn sin as he did. So
that's good. Absolutely. Very, very true. And again, take as much time on that one as you feel is necessary. That's where a lot of the application is going to come from. That's kind of the meat of it. And the 5th question there is, what kind of comfort do you expect to experience? And that may even just come out of question 4 as you discuss it. But what kind of comfort do you expect to experience?
Yeah, Kyle said it a few minutes ago, the crippling versus the freedom, that you're forgiven. I've shared here recently on Sundays that this idea of confession has really kind of overwhelmed me a little bit lately. I don't want to overstate that, but it really has kind of been on my mind and my heart a lot lately, of this idea of confession. And it's all wrapped up in our mourning, the mourning of our sin, is that idea of confession, that we see it and we call it, just like Kyle said a minute ago, we call it what God calls it. That's what confession is to call what God calls sin for us to agree with Him. And that's as simple as it is. And when we do that, then all of it is taken away. All of it. There is nothing that lingers with it at that point. And so the comfort is that sense of being cleansed, that sense of being redeemed, that we have been bought, that grace comes in and just floods this experience. Remember in Romans chapter 6, Paul says very, very clearly, he says, are we to continue in sin that grace might abound? May it never be. But where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. So we need to jump into mourning more often, because on the other end of it, just as Jesus promised, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted.
Yeah, so good. And I would say, in your groups, even in your own personal walk, as you work with your group and as you guys discuss these things, if there's a sense of guilt that hovers over you, or even a sense of abandonment, like, God is done with me, or whatever it would be, this distance that we feel between us and God, which happens.
Yeah.
My suggestion would be mourn your sin, right? Because all those things are products of dwelling in guilt and dwelling in that, and putting kind of on ourselves the task of cleansing ourselves, right?
Exactly,
and it's
right.
absolutely impossible to do that. And so when we mourn our sin, when we agree with God that it is what He calls it, and we repent of that, and we're sorrowful over what we have done, He promises to comfort us, which is what all we're looking for anyway, right? When we're feeling that way, we feel that distance, all we're looking for is comfort from Him, and He promises to give that.
Yeah, forgive adding a little bit more to this, or even in some ways deviating off, because I absolutely think they're related. I was in with our Young at Hearters, so if some of you are watching this, if that is even the chance that you would be, I was in this week with our Young at Hearters, and we were talking about the idea of, do you forgive yourself? And I realize that it's a semantics. We even talked about it on Wednesday morning with the group. That it's semantics. I think we don't literally mean that, but it's really important that we say what we mean, because when we don't say what we mean, we can sometimes go down a dangerous path. And so when we use the expression forgive ourselves, even though the heart is probably that of knowing that we've been cleansed, and we need to know, and I agree with that, learning to sit in our cleansing, to feel that, to mourn our sin, and then to allow His grace to come over us and to overwhelm us, and then we feel that freedom. That's probably what most people mean when they say that I can't forgive myself. Mm-hmm. They probably mean I don't sense that feeling of cleansing and that sense of forgiveness. What I want to correct, or help us to correct, is using the wrong terminology of being forgiven of sin, forgiving our own sin, that we can't forgive ourselves. And that's something that we need to really steer away from, because we don't forgive ourselves.
Yeah.
So
right.
That's what's important.
Absolutely. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Great week. Great passage. Very applicable. Something that we, I think, often just completely overlook, don't even realize the bondage that comes with this. So we are confident you will have a good discussion. So thanks.
Excellent.
Rock on.
Lift up what holds me down.